The guiding industry in British Columbia has a proud history, one that evolved with the fur trade, and it's closely intertwined with the province's First Nations people. Fur traders coming overland from regions such as Montreal relied heavily upon knowledgeable First Nations people to guide them to British Columbia's expansive interior and the wildlife riches that resided there. It was in the late 1800s that the world's hunting fraternity first recognized that British Columbia harbored some of North America's most magnificent big game populations. In response, local hunters started guiding services, often employing local First Nations to assist them, enabling non-resident hunters to access wildlife and the untouched and difficult-to-reach wilderness expanses of the province. In reality, this was the start of British Columbia's tourism industry. In the early years, hunting activities were largely unregulated. There were a few bounties on what were deemed problem species, some very limited protection legislation, and the ability to levy fines.
In the province was a fellow named A. Brian Williams, and he was actually the first provincial game warden. He was given the position in 1905 to 1918, and very progressive, instrumental in a lot of the game laws that came in that era, including things like non-resident licenses, specific licenses for non-residents. In 1913, there was a requirement enacted that non-residents hunting in British Columbia were required to have a guide. And that's one of the bases that the guiding industry is based on.
New guiding regulations were introduced in the 1940s and 1950s, creating different classes of guides and revising the way the growing guide outfitting industry was managed. Government then began to review and allocate guide territories, basing the structure on the success of the registered fur trap line system that had been created several decades earlier. Details concerning the structure of the guide outfitting industry were ironed out during the 1950s. 1961 marked a significant year for the guide outfitting industry. Guide territories were created, granting individuals exclusive rights to guide non-resident hunters within a specific area. In 1966, the first provincial Guide Outfitters Association, the Western Guide Outfitters Association, was formed to represent the guide outfitting industry to government. As the years progressed, legislation changed and the way outfitting was carried out evolved and developed to include stricter guidelines and regulations.
In this area here, when I first started moose hunting in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a fair number of moose. If you were guiding, probably 80–90% of your hunters connected with moose, and the locals did pretty good too. But by around about the late 70s, 78, 79, the moose were in decline. There was no getting around it. Our seasons were just a little too generous. So they brought in the two-point regulation, and you could see by the late 80s that it had definitely improved the moose population. And that's the upside of the rules and regulations.
The Western Guide Outfitters Association was renamed as the Guide Outfitters Association of British Columbia in 1982, now approaching its 50th anniversary. Today, the GOABC continues to represent the guide outfitting industry to government and advocate for science-based wildlife management.
You know, we have a tremendous diversity of wildlife, and some of the populations are doing fine, but not all the populations are where they could necessarily be. And so this is an ongoing battle for us at GOABC. We're constantly trying to remind government that they have to balance opportunity with wildlife populations.
If there needs to be a hunt, there needs to be one. It should be opened if the population justifies it. If the population drops and doesn't justify it and it has to be closed, we'll support a closure. It's all biology. And if we stick to the biology, we stick to the science, we're fine.
We have an interest in the wildlife. You know, we got there loving it, and now it's our job, it's our duty, you know, to make sure that those wildlife are healthy and that they remain, you know, those populations remain viable in our area.
In the last decade, GOABC has begun to establish themselves as progressive within the field. as hunters carefully monitor, document, and analyze data from their respective territories and regions.
A few years ago, Marco Morrow, one of my clients, we were out hunting. We'd seen a lot of moose in that area. Marco had shot one. And I said to Marco, wouldn't it be neat to know whether these bulls were actually related? And why is there so many big, old, mature bulls in this one area? And Marco says, well, we just need to do a DNA study.
So we know that if we can get the DNA off these spots, which is a fairly straightforward thing to do, we believe, and if we do this over years, we will have the opportunity to look at expansions and contractions in genetic diversity within the population and infer population health based on those kinds of studies.
When you see an organization like this one develop international wildlife symposia, when you see them launch genetic sampling assays for wildlife populations in the districts that they help manage and in which they hunt, these are really and truly unique efforts being made by this organization to show that they really do wish to be part of the ongoing and meaningful exercises for the conservation of the extraordinary wildlife legacy that British Columbia has.